Hello and welcome back to another big face-off for the PS5 and its storage. Today we're looking primarily at heat sinks. We're looking at heat dissipation from heat sinks inside the PS5, and we're looking at four very special heat sinks, and by special I mean either designed for the system or massively popular. And in today's video we're going to be looking at how they deal with the heat dissipation from the controller of the SSD, the little brains on the SSDs inside the system, but as well as that we're also looking at the general temperature of the system, because having a heatsink that can maintain the cool temperature required for an SSD and maintain that high performance and durability is great, but not at the expense of the overall performance of the system if the rest of the console starts getting too hot. And in today's video we're going to be looking at heavy write, heavy read, and overall gameplay performance and temperature of the SSD in the system in Red Dead Redemption 2 and GTA 5. The reason we're using those games is because those games are big open world games that we can leave running effectively on autopilot for the same period of time to try to match things up as much as we can. Both games in these systems and tests have been running for 25 minutes, and most of these test results have either been available in other videos that are published or coming soon or clipped. These are the full versions of those sped up to about 8 or 9 times speed. And in today's video, all of the SSDs are going to be connected and utilizing an E18 controller SSD with 96 layout 3D TLC NAND. So in the case of today's video, what we're looking at is how much heat dissipation takes place with these heat sinks. Now, we are looking at the PS5 designed Sabrent heatsink that's already inside this system. We've pre-installed it and attached our nodes as well. We have one node that's going to be looking at the temperature of the controller on the SSD, and another node that's in the middle of the system. Again, we've already posted loads of photos. There should be a guide in the description as well. The Sabrent PS5 designed heatsink at $25. We're going to be comparing that against the following. We're going to be looking at the $10 Eluteng, the one that we compared against last time on the Sabrent video. And this again is $10, $15, very simple, designed for PC use with active airflow inside, which means that although it's great for dissipating heat in a large PC with loads of air knocking around, inside the more compact little tiny M2 slot of this system, it's a different story. So although it's cheaper, there's an argument that is it as effective as more PS5 designed heatsinks around this system. Next we'll be comparing it against this, the Elecgear ELP5C, or just the Elecgear for the rest of the video. This heatsink that we've already looked at before, it's a big chunky sideways heatsink there, and again it fits inside the slot of your PS5 M2 upgrade slot, but it's huge, as you can see there. And this heatsink not only fills that bay, but it has a large amount of coverage to capture the air running through that system. It also has a copper heat pipe inside to capture all of that air, and to capture all of the heat from the SSD to assist dissipation. So again, much bigger, heavily designed, but arranging depending on where you are in the world. It costs about $35 to $50 to buy, massively more expensive. Finally, we're looking at this. This is the INEO copper Heatpipe PS5 SSD heatsink. This heatsink is the biggest of the lot so far. It sits inside with the SSD inside that slot there at the bottom with thermal pads, and not only is there the heat collection and kind of dissipation drawing in that aluminium chassis there around the SSD, but also there is a copper pipe that's drawing heat up here into the way of the fan inside. We've already done a hardware review of this, hopefully that's live already, along with its own individual tests, but we haven't seen how well this $35 heatsink compares against all of the others here on the table. And that's basically it. We're going to run a bunch of tests, look at all of the performance, how they compare, see which one dissipates the most heat, and ultimately try to help you to find out which one or any is best suited to your PS5 needs. Real quick disclaimer, these have all been recorded at different times of day, at different days of the week, at different days of the month. So ambient temperature here in the UK, of course, plays its part. We're not looking primarily at the starting and the ending number per se. We are looking at the difference in between, how much heat has been dissipated, and overall we want to look at how much heat is dissipated and taken care of on the SSD, but also the active overall temperature, because again, one of these sucking all the heat out of the SSD, making it perform great, is a good thing, but not at the expense of increasing temperature or blocking airflow to the CPU, the GPU, the memory and the board inside. But that's enough build up. Let's crack on and look at those results. Right, so our first game was Red Dead Redemption. Now in Red Dead Redemption, tested on all 4 of these SSDs, we're going to test this in 2 separate areas. The first thing you're looking at here on Red Dead is all 4 of the heatsinks there, the Eluteng, the Sabrent, the INEO Heatpipe and the Elecgear, and this time we've got the thermo sensor showing us the reading on the controller. For those that aren't aware, the controller is the brains of the SSD. That's where all the work is getting done, and on the SSD, although things like the NAND, where your data lives, the memory, which is kind of the pass-through or the hands of the SSD, can afford to get a little warm, you don't want that SSD controller getting hot, because it can affect your performance, and if it goes higher than about 70C, it will throttle the SSD. The ideal choke point is between 30 to 50C. So as you can see there, they've all been quite similar in the way they started. The Eluteng at 34.9, the Sabrent heatsink there at 33.5, the Heatpipe at 33.8, and the Elecgear there at the end at 30.8. Much lower than the others, but you've got to factor in the ambient temperature around the room. Remember, we're not looking at the start or the end number too hard. We're looking at what the temperature difference is between them by the end of this. Now, in Red Dead, we went for the autopilot, as you can see here on screen. And that autopilot that you're watching there, carrying on all the way through, that is what's going, kind of making the game move forward. You've got a lot of assets getting pulled in, a lot of activity all the way through, and between all of them, even early doors, you can see that that Eluteng, that PC designed heatsink there, was the one that not only started at the highest temperature at the beginning, but also raised the highest overall, reaching a height by the end of this session here, 25 minutes of sped up gameplay, down to went up to 40.8C. So again, 40.8C there, so that's 5.9 degrees of increase between them, and that's the SSD on the SSD controller. The Sabrent there went up to 35.6, so that was an increase of just 2.1 degrees. The Heatpipe and the Elecgear, both of them raised by just 1.4 degree, up to 35.2 and 31.4 respectively. So again, by far the lowest temperature for the controller on board, but again, both of those 2 heatsinks are ones that take advantage of that copper heat pipe there, so that was unsurprising. I hate seagulls. But at the same time, we need to check the ambient temperature, the surrounding PS5 temperature, because if the rest of it's hot, that could affect the CPU, GPU and memory. So now we repeated this test, this time on the ambient temperature on a different node. So when repeating this test once again on Red Dead Redemption, it's worth highlighting that what we did was cancel the gameplay of Red Dead Redemption, go back to the PSN menu, leave the PlayStation idle for about a minute or so, and then reboot Red Dead and get back into the game, where we then tested the ambient air temperature outside of that SSD bay. Now, all of them started relatively similar temperatures there. The Eluteng, that PC small $10 heatsink, it started at 24.4. The Sabrent PS5 heatsink at 25.8. The Heatpipe from INEO at 27.3, the highest of them, and the Elecgear at 23.1. Now that Heatpipe being the highest of all of them, normally I wouldn't highlight that temperature difference, but this time it's quite important, because we've noticed in previous testing that that external pipe that comes out of the M2 slot and near the fan has resulted, even previously measured, in the overall temperature in the internal casing of the PS5, but not in the SSD slot, to be higher. And you can see there that starting at a higher degree there, although the increase is quite small, the increase is still higher than all of the others in the ambient temperature, and we've always wondered about the effects of that copper pipe on the rest of the PS5 system. It's one thing to have a cool SSD, but the last thing you want is a cool SSD to the detriment of everything else in the system. Now, between all of them, unsurprisingly, the one that maintained or created the largest increase was that Eluteng, the cheapest $10 one there. Again, I was kind of surprised that the copper heat pipe wasn't the highest, but it wasn't, it was the second highest. But the Eluteng went up to 25.9, an increase of 1.5 degrees. The Sabrent, just 0.2 degrees difference, making it to 26C. And the heat pipe, as mentioned, second highest at 0.4, ending at 27.7. And finally, the Elecgear being by far the smallest increase at just 0.1 degrees increase, going from 23.1 to just 23.2C. The Elecgear massively winning that round there on the ambient internal temperature, which is a real tick to the box of that one with its much flat but larger heatsink panel. So that's enough for Red Dead Redemption. Next up, we wanted to make our way over to Grand Theft Auto and repeat these tests just to double check that it wasn't game specific. Once again, we closed down the system, left it off for a few minutes, and then booted up GTA to retest. Let's go. Now for GTA, we pretty much repeated what we did in Red Dead Redemption. In GTA there, we hailed a cab and then utilised the cab to take us to another whole area of the map. It allowed us to create a much more controlled and streamlined environment that also introduced lots of background assets and activity in the background with little intervention from ourselves. There's the odd time when the cabbie would go off the road or kick us out of the cab, but we were able to restart things as quickly as we could. Now, in terms of the SSD's controller temperature, we can notice here that because this was the third range of testing, along with transferring of games previous to these tests, the result was the general level of temperature was noticeably higher this time around. Now the Eluteng, once again, highest by a notable degree, starting at 40C. The Sabrent at 38.3. The heat pipe on the INEO cooler at 34.8, and once again the Elecgear being much lower than everyone else at 26.7, another ringing endorsement for this device in terms of the SSD temperature at the very least. Now, as we went through the game there, we can see that the temperature increases are actually quite small. Maybe it was because the individual heatsinks hadn't had enough time to cool down to absolute stone cold temperature, something we didn't want to allow anyway. But nevertheless, they all had only small differences between the start temperature of the SSD controller and the end temperature towards the end there. But of the four of them, the winner was surprisingly the heat pipe cooler. Now, I thought the Elecgear with its lower temperature would have been the overall, and again, if we were to look at the starting temperatures, the Elecgear clearly has an advantage and wins. But in terms of actual heat dissipation, the heat pipe from INEO actually dropped the temperature, going down 0.4 degrees, ending at 34.4C, a small difference overall. The next one was the Eluteng, surprisingly. Mind you, that had already started quite high at 40 and ending at 40.5, an increase of just half a degree. Next up was both the Sabrent and the Elecgear drawing with heat dissipation of an equal 1.4 degrees change, ending with the Sabrent at 39.7 and the Elecgear at 28.1. So again, slightly surprising results there, but still, let's not completely overlook that the Elecgear started incredibly low, which surely is a feather in its cap. But let's make our way over to repeating these tests again, looking at the ambient airflow and general system temperature now. Once again, I closed GTA, left the system idle for a little over a minute, and then rebooted GTA and repeated these tests, but this time using that secondary temperature node. This node looking at the overall temperature inside the system again. Now, the temperature that they all started at, there was quite marked differences between them, broken them down into two camps. Now, the Eluteng started at 32.7C, the Sabrent starting at 30.5C, the heat pipe from INEO starting at 29.3, and once again the Elecgear starting ridiculously low there at 21.8. By far the lowest temperature of all of them there, dropping 7 degrees since we left it in the previous GTA test. Now, between them, the increase wasn't that large for any of them, the ambient temperature not raising that much indeed. Of course, the one that we were concerned about the most was, of course, the heat pipe, because last time that heat pipe had increased things noticeably. And in this case, once again, it was the second highest increase, although that increase of the ambient general PS5 temperature was still incredibly low, all of these SSD heatsinks making little to no impact on the surrounding PS5 environment. By far, the most effective ambient temperature drop came from the Eluteng, a real change from what we saw earlier. It started at 32.7 C, and by the end of this test would end up at 32.4 C, a drop of 0.3 degrees. So that's minus 0.3 degrees throughout the course of GTA's playtime there. The Sabrent, on the other hand, starting at 30.5 C, ended at 30.9, just an increase of 0.4 degrees. Again, a very small change. The INEO Heatpipe, starting at 29.3, ended things at 30.6. So again, a very small increase of just shy of a degree there, a total result of 0.9. Finally, the Elecgear, rather changing things around, was the one that had the largest increase, going up to 22.9. That's an increase of 1.1 degrees. Still absolutely tiny. And once again, although I said I would try my best not to look at them, the very fact that it started at 21.8, ending at 22.9, was incredibly low regardless. And in terms of gameplay, really, really impressive. But now let's move over to some heavy read and write activity, sending data to and from the system to see how these heatsinks deal with extended targeted use. So the first thing we wanted to do here was test the read activity. This is when the PlayStation 5 is reading data extensively from the SSD contained under these respective heatsinks. Now we read and then moved data over from the heatsink equipped SSD and onto the PlayStation 5's own SSD. Now all four of these had very different heats already applied at start. The Eluteng $10 heatsink started at 40 degrees, the Sabrent at 40.1, the Heatpipe cooler at 26.1, and finally the Elecgear at just 29. Again, noticeably lower than most of them, but maybe not the Heatpipe there. Now, the temperature between all of them did increase, but not anything too dramatic from what I could see overall. It is worth highlighting there that the Heatpipe was the one that really surprised me the most, with its temperature difference there being noticeably larger overall compared with the others. The Eluteng there at the top, that $10 heatsink, not being an enormous change, but still nonetheless, I was really surprised at what I saw here. In the end, as we went through all of this transfer between them, the one that was the best was the Sabrent. The Sabrent having the smallest increase overall between the start and finish temperatures. Overall, the Eluteng starting at 40C ended things at 46.2, an increase of 6.2 C. The Sabrent at 40.1 ending things at 45.1, an increase of just 5 degrees. The Heatpipe had a real massive increase there as the fans increased the temperature on that internal SSD, resulting in an increase of 13.5 degrees, an enormous change. And the Elecgear at just 5.6 degrees, clearly showing that it had a very small impact on the PS5 system. Now let's look at heavy write activity on these SSDs. Now this next test was about testing how hot the SSD controller would get when we were sending that data over. So we're sending over 350 gig of data comprised of multiple games to see how well the SSD deals with it. Performance has to be largely ignored as the PS5 does a lot of encryption and compression in its transfer of data. So we're not looking at performance times. We're just looking at how hot the controller got. Now the Eluteng started things at 31.1 C, quite low and one of the lowest temperatures for that particular heatsink throughout all of our tests. The Sabrent PS5 started at 39.2, slightly higher than I would have expected, but again, we've done a lot of tests. The Heatpipe from INEO started at 34.5, and the Elecgear at the end, or as always, the lowest temperature of all of them at 24. Once again, that can be a combination of its build, but also just a general ambient temperature that day. Now, between all of them, the one that increased the most was the Eluteng. Now, this isn't unusual, we've seen this before. The Eluteng heatsink, designed for a PC with more ambient air and a larger open case with more fans, relies heavily on the dissipation of that heat, whereas the other heatsinks here are designed to take advantage of the PS5's fans primarily. The result being that the Eluteng started at 31.1, went up to 46.5, an increase there of 15.4 degrees. It's still heavy, right, but that's quite a jump. Now, the Sabrent, on the other hand, was by far the best, increasing at 39.2 up to a height of 40.8, an increase of just 1.6 degrees, very small indeed. The Heatpipe, starting at 34.5, ended things at 36.4, an increase of 1.9 degrees, again very, very impressive, thanks to that external pipe no less. And the Elecgear, more in line with the Eluteng, really surprised me, starting at 24 and ending at 36, therefore largely removing it from that low temperature bracket we'd seen up to this point, with an increase of 12.1 degrees. Overall, between them, the Sabrent really proved itself very well here, and overall was the best performer for temperature dissipation overall. Now, when we look at these four heatsinks with the heavy writing activity, it's worth bearing a few things in mind. First and foremost, between all of them, they did start with wildly different temperature starts. That, of course, is something we have to bear in mind and, of course, factor in. But given the extensive stuff we've done today, as well as they're all being filmed at very different days in terms of British weather, gotta love living here, the result is that ambient base level temperature is hard to nail down. Overall, though, between all of them, I have a feeling once I crunch the numbers that the Elecgear or the INEO Heatpipe cooler are going to be the winners of the day here. The Sabrent PS5 Heatsink is probably the best value in my opinion, but overall between them, let's go through these results and see just how far each one went and where they stood out on their strengths. And so the conclusion. As you can see on screen, these are the results from everything we saw today across all the different games, all the different reads and the different writes. Overall, if we give a point to each one that came first, or in the case of each one that drew and we give them a point each, the scores are surprisingly even, with 2 points to the Elecgear, 2 points to the Sabrent, 2 points to the INEO Heatpipe, and even 1 point to the Eluteng at 1 point. If we only look at temperature difference, we can learn a few things. First and foremost, all of these heatsinks in their own way seemingly work very well, but just remember they've all got different price tags. Some of them were much better at internal performance, temperature management. Some of them were much better at dealing with the SSD's controller temperature overall. The general running performance and the general temperature all the way through heavily favoured the Elecgear and the Heatpipe to have a lower SSD temperature both at boot and in general operation. However, once it came to the internal performance, not so much the internal performance, but the internal ambient temperature of the PS5, which is incredibly important to the CPU, GPU and memory, it has to be said that both the Sabrent and the Elecgear were arguably the better overall. The Heatpipe cooler is still a great SSD heatsink, I've got to say, and a very novel piece of kit, but arriving at quite a price tag and with still not quite well displayed information on how well it impacts the internal PS5 system, I'm slightly reluctant to recommend it over the Elecgear and the Sabrent. The Eluteng still holds its own as a $10 heatsink, and if you've already bought that for yourself and it's in your system, you've only been put out $5 to $10, and it's a great little heatsink regardless, with a lot of the temperature differences, as you've seen on screen, being very small indeed. However, because it's so cheap, if you do see one of the other heatsinks appear on the market for a decent enough deal, maybe Black Friday, Prime Day, Boxing Day or something, it does make it a worthy purchase, because these PS5 designed heatsinks, for the most part from what I've seen, do what they say on the tin. They take advantage of the negative airflow, and as you've seen from our ambient and airflow temp monitors there, the impact on the overall system is very, very small, and particularly when you think about how much that Eluteng struggled to remove a lot of that heat via dissipation in that closed little compartment. But this has been my main comparison of these top PS5 heatsinks right now. There's another test coming soon involving the WD Black and the Seagate FireCuda first party heatsinks, and I recommend you check that one out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video. I know it's been a long one and an analytically boring one, but I think a necessary one nonetheless. So if you did enjoy it, chuck me a like. It helps me understand what I'm doing right and makes every video better than the last. Click subscribe or the bell to be notified on further content as it becomes live, and of course helps me understand what you guys are waiting for the most, and therefore I can set the schedule up to be best for you guys. Finally, if you need free advice on the right PS5 storage system, or indeed any SSD or storage system for your home or business needs, there's a free advice section and a guide to today's video linked in the description. Take advantage of the free advice from me and Eddie the web guy, two humans giving free advice. No email, you shut your email, we don't do anything with it. There's donate buttons, use them, ignore them. It might take us a day or so to answer your email, but we try our best to answer every one. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.